Hey, what's going on, guys? In this video we're going to create a React project based off one of my favorite shows of all time, Breaking Bad. And there's an API that we can use here. It's at breakingbadapi.com/documentation, and basically we can get information on all the characters, on episodes, we can get different quotes, death information, and there's different endpoints that we can hit. This is the base URL. And if we hit API/characters, it'll give us all the characters. You can also get them by ID. You can see some of the data that we can get. And we can also narrow it down by name, which is going to allow us to create this filter right here. So basically, we're going to fetch the characters, fetch the data, making the HTTP requests, and then we're going to show all the images, because you get these nice high-quality images of all the characters. And we're going to have a little CSS effect so that when we hover over one of these images, it shows us the name, shows us the actor name, the nickname, birthday, the status, if they're alive or not. Walter White is presumed dead, Jesse's alive, Hank is deceased. So we'll get that data, and then we're also going to create this search or this filter component where we can just type something in. So if I put a J in, it's going to filter down the characters to anything with a J. Put an E in, that narrows it down to Jesse. And every time I type something in here, it fires off an event, and it makes a request to the API and narrows it down by the name query right here. Okay, so that's what we'll be building. It's pretty simple. We're not using Redux or context or anything. This is a really good project for beginners to intermediates, people that just want to build something. So hopefully you enjoy it, and let's get started. So I'm going to jump into VS Code, and I just have a completely empty folder here, my terminal open, and I'm going to use create React app. So I'm going to run npx create-react-app, and I want to generate this React application in the current folder. So I'm just going to put a dot. And npx just allows us to run it without actually having to install it globally. Okay, so it'll set up React, React DOM, and all that good stuff. Okay, so that's all set. So we have all of our React files here. I'm going to clear this up, and there's one dependency that I want to install, and that's Axios. Axios is an HTTP library so that we can make requests. If you want to use fetch, that's fine. I just prefer Axios. And then we have some cleanup to do here. So if we look in, actually let's run our server first. So if we run npm start, that should start up on 3000. This should get replaced. And we should just see the landing page here. All right, so let's do some cleanup in the source folder. There's a bunch of stuff we don't need. We're not doing tests. We can get rid of this. Service worker, logo, SVG, we don't need that. We don't need the index CSS. We don't need the app.test file either. So we're just going to go ahead and trash all those files. And then we'll get some errors down here because we need to change some stuff in index.js where we're importing the index CSS. We want to get rid of that. We want to get rid of importing the service worker. We want to get rid of the unregister down here. Save that, and then let's go into our app.js, which is our main app component. We don't want this logo anymore. We deleted it. We do want the app CSS because that's where I'm going to put all the styling for this app. And then here, we want to get rid of everything except the wrapping div here. And we'll actually change this to container. And in here, for now, let's just say hello. And I'm also going to just change this to an arrow function. It's just preference. Save that. And in the app CSS, there's some default styling. I'm just going to get rid of all that for now and save. And then if I go back to my browser, we should just see hello. Okay, so we just kind of got rid of all the stuff that we don't need. Now, there are some images that we'll be using, and I have a folder on my desktop. Let me just open this real quick. So I have some images here. We have a spinner that we're going to use for when we're fetching the data. We have the logo, we have the favicon, and we have the background. And you can get these in the repository in the description. So I'm going to put this whole IMG folder right in the source folder. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that right in there so we have access to these images. Now the favicon, if we go in the public folder here, you can see there's already a favicon, which is just the React logo. I'm going to just delete that. and then we're going to move this favicon to the public folder and replace that. Okay, and then in the index.html, I'm just going to change the title from React App to Breaking Bad Cast, and we'll save that, close it up, and if we take a look now, let's go ahead and reload. Now you can see we have Breaking Bad Cast with the favicon. You might have to do a hard refresh and F5 or whatever. So the next thing that I want to do is just handle the styling. Now this isn't a CSS course, so I'm just going to open up my app CSS and I'm going to paste in the styling, which isn't much. So just paste that in. Most of it is pretty simple. We're using the background image from this image folder right here as the background. The most complicated thing here are the cards, because we do have that flip effect. So we're using transform, rotate, but I'm not going to get into all that because that's not what this is about. I can do another video showing you how to do that. But this should be all the CSS we need, so we'll save that. And if we just take a look, now it should look like this. Okay, so let's start creating our components. I think the first thing we should do is probably the header. That's the easiest. So in the source folder, let's create a folder called components. And I'm assuming that you have at least a little bit of experience with React. I would suggest watching my crash course if you haven't watched that already. We don't get into hooks in the crash course. We will be doing hooks here. However, in the crash course, you'll learn all the fundamentals, what a component is, how that works, and so on. So the first component we want is the header, and I'm actually going to create a subfolder called UI. Okay, and in the UI folder, let's create a file called header.js. All right, so in header.js, I'm going to create a functional component because we're going to be using React hooks. Probably should have said that in the beginning. And I do have an extension that I would highly recommend, which is this ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native snippets. And this will allow us to easily generate a component with RA. There's a bunch of different types of components. You have classes, you have regular functions, you have arrow functions. I use this right here, RAFCE, which gives us an arrow function component, and it exports it down at the bottom rather than from here. So this is how I like to format my components, but feel free to do it however you'd like. Now we're going to have the logo in the header. So remember, we have this logo right here, and since we're using React, which uses Webpack, we can go ahead and just import an image. So import logo from, and then we want to go up into, let's see, go up 2 levels into image, and then we want logo.png. And then down here in the return, let's use a header tag, just an HTML5 header tag, and I'm going to give this a class name of, actually let's use single quotes, of center. And that's just going to make this a flex box and just center everything both horizontally and vertically. And then from here, let's put an image tag. Why is that not working? Why is Emmett's not working for some reason? So we'll just type it out. So source is going to be the logo that we just brought in. And let's just put an alt in here like that. Save. And that's it for the header. So pretty simple. We're just bringing in a logo using a header tag with the class of center, adding our logo image. And now let's go to app.js and let's bring that in. So we want to import header from, and we want to go into components and /UI/header, and then we'll put that, let's see, let's get rid of this, and we'll put this right here and save, and let's go back, and there we go. So now we have our logo and it's centered and looks nice. So now I think the filter I'll do last, or the search box, I'll do that last. Right now what I would like to do is just fetch the data and then have those cards. So let's go ahead and minimize that, and we're going to be using hooks for this application. There's 2 specific hooks we'll be using. One is useState, which allows us to use state within our functional component, and then useEffect, which we're going to use to fire off when the component loads to make an HTTP request to get the data. So we want to get the character data, including the image and the name and all that stuff. So let's go up here and let's bring in from React those two hooks. So we want useState and we want useEffect. Okay, and then we'll start off with the state. So inside the function, inside the component here, let's say const and open up some brackets. Now, if you've never used the useState hook before, basically we need two things here. We need to define this piece of state, which I'm going to call items. This is going to represent the characters that come in from the API. I could call it characters, but I'm just going to call it items. And then set items is going to be the function we use to change the state, to manipulate this piece of state. And then we set this to the useState hook with a default, which for us, is going to be an empty array to begin with. So it's going to start as an empty array, but once we make the request in the useEffect hook, then we'll fill this array with the data from the API. Okay, now I'm going to copy this down, and this next piece of state is going to be isLoading, because we want to know if the data is being loaded or not, if it's still being fetched. So we'll say isLoading, and then set isLoading will be the function to change that. And the default, what I like to do is set this to true. So it's true by default, and then after it's fetched, after it's loaded, then we set it to false. Okay, but I mean, that's just my preference. So to make the request, that needs to go into the useEffect hook. So we're going to use that here. useEffect takes in an arrow function. Now, we're using Axios to make our HTTP request. So let's import Axios from Axios. I did install that, right? I forget. Yeah, I did. Okay, so we're going to import Axios. Now, Axios returns a promise. Now, I don't want to use the .then syntax, so I want to use a sync await. However, we can't just put a sync like on the useEffect arrow function, so we need to create a new function here. We'll just call it fetch items, and set that to a sync. Okay, and then inside here, let's say const result. So this represents what we get back from Axios, and we're going to await because Axios returns a promise. And we could do .get, but since it's a GET request, we can just do this. And then inside backticks here, we want to put our endpoint. So let me just go. So right here, the base URL, we want that. Put that in there, and then slash characters. Now we will have a name parameter like this in a little bit for the filter, but for now I'm just going to leave this as is. This should get us all the characters. And underneath the result, let's just go ahead and do a console log, and we should be able to say result result.data, and that will give us the data that that we get from this API. Now, when we use useEffect, we need to add any dependencies as a second parameter here. So we don't have any right now. We will when we have the filter query, but for now we're just going to put an empty set of brackets. All right, and then I think that should do it. We should be able to see the data. So I'm going to save this, and let's go back here and let's open up our console. Let's see, items, just ignore that. But let's go ahead. Why is this not firing off? Oh, I do this all this. Whenever I use a sync await in useEffect, I do this. So we created fetch items, but we never actually called it. useEffect is firing off, but fetch items is not. So we want to go under fetch items and just call it. All right. So now over here in the console, you can see we have 63 items, and we have all the characters. So if we look at the first one, it gives us a bunch of data. It gives us the ID, gives us the image, the name, the portrayed is the actor's name, the status. It also gives us, even gives you like Better Call Saul appearance, which obviously he has none because he's dead. And then the appearance, so these are the seasons, I believe. So obviously Walter appears in all 5 seasons. Occupation is an array, so high school chemistry teacher, meth kingpin. I'm not going to use the occupation or appearance, but you can, I mean, if you want to add to this application you can. But anyway, you can see the data we're getting. So now what we want to do is set this result data to this piece of state, the items, right? So we do that with set items. And we'll just pass in here result.data. So that's going to set that. And then we also want to make sure we set loading to false. So set is loading. We want to set that from true to false because we've got the data, it's loaded, it's done. So now that's set to false. All right, so that pretty much takes care of this. Now, obviously we want to take that data and we want to display it. So what I'm going to do is just make sure I save this, and I'm going to create a new component. In fact, I'm going to create a new folder in components called characters, because I'm just separating the UI stuff from the character stuff. And inside characters, I'm going to have a file and component called CharacterGrid.js. So this is just going to be responsible for creating the character grid of images or cards, whatever you want to call them. So let's generate a component here. So character grid, and this is going to get passed in the items, right? So right now we have items. We also have isLoading, which I'm also going to pass in as a prop. So let's bring in up top here. Let's bring in the character grid, which is in characters, character grid. Make sure we change this to character grid, and we'll put this down here right under the header. So character grid, and like I said, we want to pass in as props isLoading. We want to pass in that isLoading value. So this isLoading value gets changed when we call set isLoading. Okay, because we set that as the function to manipulate this piece of state. We also want to pass the items in. So we'll say items, and we'll pass in the item state. Okay, so we're just taking our state, our global state in our app.js, and passing it down into character grid as a prop. Now, when we pass in a prop, we need to catch them in here. So we could do props and then access props.items, but I'm going to use destructuring here and just say items. That way we don't have to use props dot, and we also want isLoading. Okay. Now here in the return, we want to check to see if it's still loading or not. If it is, we want to show a spinner. So let's say return and then is loading, and we want to use a ternary here. So if it's loading, then do something else, then do something else. Now for now, I'm just going to put an H1 because we don't have our spinner component yet, and I'm just going to put the text loading. If it's not, then we want to basically map through the items that are passed in and output them as cards. So here, let's do a section. Whoops, can't do that. Section. Let me just, yeah. So we'll have a section, and I'm actually going to give this a class name of cards. So cards, if we look at our CSS real quick, let's see, cards. So cards is display grid, and it's a 4-column grid. All right, and we also have a media query so that when it's under 800 pixels, it's a 2-column grid, and when it's under 500, it's a 1-column grid. And I have plenty of videos on CSS grid if you're interested. So inside the section here, we want to then map through the items. So we're going to open up an expression here and say items.map, which is in a high order array method. It loops through, but it also allows you to output whatever you want, basically. So this takes an arrow function with an item. So we're looping through the items, and we're saying for each item, what do we want to do? And we actually don't want curly braces because we're rendering JSX here. So let's open up some parentheses. And for each one, we're going to have a separate component for this specific item, but for now, I'll just put an H1, and we should be able to access, let's just do item.name, like that. All right, so if I save this and we go back, now you can see we just have a grid of the names, which obviously isn't what we want, but this shows us that we're fetching the data, we're able to pass it into the character grid and at least output the name. Now we do need, you see this warning over here, we do need a unique key prop when we create a list, and that's what this is. When we use the dot map, that creates a React list. So we're not keeping the H1, but just to show you, to get rid of that error, we can just set the key, and it has to be unique, so we can take the item and we'll use the character underscore ID, because that's what the API uses, is char ID. And now that error should go away. And if we look at one of these items here, you can see char ID. That's where I got that from. Alright, so now let's work on the specific character item component, because obviously we don't just want an H1. So in characters, I'm going to create a new file called CharacterItem.js. Like that. Alright, and then let's go ahead and we'll generate a component here, so character item, and this is going to get passed in an item as a prop, so I'm going to go ahead and add that here, and then we want to style that. Actually, before we do the styling, we'll just output the name and bring it into character grid. So import character item from /character item, and then we should be able to replace this H1 here with that component. So character item, and we still want the key on it like this, and then we don't need that. What we want to do is pass the entire item in. Okay, so we'll save that, and if we take a look, we should now still see the headings here, or the names, whatever, titles. Now in the character item, we want to style this, and we have access to everything, all the data on the item, right? So if I console log here item, and we look over here, you can see that we have all the data on all the characters. So we can use any of these properties, any of this data inside this component. So let's get rid of that. And as far as what we want to render, the JSX here, I'm going to paste it in just because I don't want to type it all out. I'll just go over it. So, and you can copy this from the repository, but basically we have a div with the class of card, we have a card inner class, card front, and on the front of the card we have the image. So this item.image is coming from the prop that's passed into character item. Okay, it's being passed in right here, and it's coming from the map, the list that we created here. And then we just have this card back class, and we have an H1 with the name. Then we have a list here with the actor name, which is portrayed. We have nickname, birthday, status. Okay, so pretty simple. Let's go ahead and just make sure we save this. And if we go back, now you can see we have our cards. We have the front of the card, which is the image, and then the back, which has the H1 and the unordered list. All right, so that part's done, and it shows all the characters. If you want to move on and add pagination, you can do that, but I didn't want to make this video too long. So now that we get all of the characters, we want to be able to basically search or filter them down. So let's create that component. So we can close this up, we can close up CharacterGrid, and let's go to UI, Components UI, and let's create a new file here called, call it search.js. So we're going to generate an arrow function component here, and we need to bring in useState, because this is going to be a form, and when you use a form, usually every input in the form is going to have its own piece of state. So we're going to have a text field, and I'm just going to change this div to a section, give it a class name of search. All right, and then here we'll have a form, and inside here we're going to have just one input, and let's give this some some attributes here. So we want this to be the type of text. We want this to have a class name. So class name is going to be form control. It's going to give it some styling. And let's add a placeholder. So placeholder, we'll say search characters. Get rid of that. Now, as far as, well, you know what? Let's just leave it. Well, I'm going to add an autofocus, but before I get to the state or anything like that, I just want to insert it into the DOM, insert it into our main app.js. So let's bring it in here. So we'll go ahead and just copy this down and change this to UI/search, and change that to search. And we're going to put this just right below the header and above the character grid. All right, so we'll save that and let's take a look. Good, so at least we can see this. It doesn't do anything, but it is showing up. So now, to give functionality to this, the first thing we need to do is add, like I said, a piece of state for this input. So right here, let's say, what is going on with this? Something's funky with VS Code today. So let's say const, and we're going to just call this text and then set text to manipulate this piece of state. And it's going to be just an empty string by default. Okay, and then for the value for this, the value here is going to be that text value. Okay, and this is just our local state for this component. Now, an input is a control component, so we need to have an onChange event here. So onChange is going to fire off whenever it changes, whenever we type something into it. And this is going to be an arrow function, and this will take in our event parameter, and then we're just going to call set text and pass in e.target.value. So basically what this will do is every time we type something into this input, it's going to run this onChange, and it's going to put whatever we type in into this piece of state right here. All right, so if I save this and go back, it's still not going to filter yet, but if we look at our React Dev Tools here, let's go to search, and you can see right here the state is whatever is typed in, and whatever I type in here, it's going to get put down, it's going to get put into that local state. Okay, now we have an issue here. We need to be able to take what is typed in here, and we need to be able to add that, basically put that into a query into what we're fetching. So this should be what is it, name? Yeah, name, and then set that to something. So here we put, actually we need to use this syntax. So this would be some kind of query. All right, now this query is going to be part of our app level state. So I'm going to go up here and set this to just an empty string, and this is going to be set query, and this is going to be query. So this is going to represent whatever the name is, whatever we type in. Now, how do we get what is typed into this form up to this useEffect that's in the app.js? We do that through props. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, instead of just calling set text directly right here, I'm going to change this to a function called onChange, and I'll go up here and say const onChange, and that's going to take in, it's going to take in whatever this value is, which I'm going to just call Q for query. And then we still want to call set text and set it to whatever is typed in, but I'm also going to have a function here called getQuery and set that to Q. All right, now this getQuery doesn't exist yet. What I'm going to do is add it as a prop onto search. Okay, so we'll have a prop called getQuery and set that to something. Now this getQuery, since it's a prop, of course it needs to be passed in here, right? So we'll pass that in, and then what we're doing is calling that getQuery. Now what that get query does depends on what we put here. So what I'm going to do is actually create a function. So this get query here is going to equal an arrow function that takes the query. Okay, so we'll be able to access this, which is going to be whatever this is, and gets passed in here. Okay, and then what we'll do is call a function here called setQuery and set that to Q. Now this setQuery is part of our state, right? So we're just setting this value using this method right here. So we're passing that query up from the search into this, basically into our app.js. Now we need to somehow have this change, right, or this get called when we type something in. And to do that is really simple. We can just add query as a dependency. Okay, so what this means here, dependency, is whenever this value is changed, this useEffect is going to fire off again. Just having it empty, it's just going to fire off right at the beginning, and it's going to fetch our characters and so on, and that's it. But now, since we have this query state that's going to be changing every time we type something in, then it's a dependency, meaning that this is going to fire off every time that's changed. Okay, I hope that makes sense, and I'm just going to just comment that out. Now, one thing I just realized is we didn't do the spinner. So if we go back here and we reload, you can see we do have the loading text, which might be fine, but I think a spinner is a nice touch. So let's just add that real quick. So we have the spinner.gif in the image folder here. So in the UI folder in the components, I'm going to create a spinner.js file here, and we'll go ahead and just generate a function, and we need to bring that spinner image in. Oops, I got double cursors here. So we're going to bring that in. Let's say import spinner from, and that's going to be, so we're going to go up and then up another level into images, and then what is it called? Just spinner.gif. All right, so in here, let's see, we're going to get rid of this div, and we're going to have an image. Okay, so image, and then source is going to be spinner, and we're just going to add a little bit of inline style here, so double curly braces, and set the width. Let's set the width to 200 pixels, and we'll set margin auto because we want it to be in the middle, and we want to display as a block. Okay, and then we're just going to add an alt, and for the alt we'll just say loading. Alright, so we'll save that, and then let's go into, let's see, so that's going to be in the character grid, I believe. Alright, so character grid is where we have this. We're checking if it's loading, and then we have the text, only instead of the text we want the spinner component. So let's go ahead and import, what do we want to do? We want to go up one level into UI and spinner and spinner, and then instead of this H1 here, we can just get rid of this and just put our spinner. Okay, so we'll save that, we'll go back, reload, and there we go. So that looks better than just having the text reloading. Alright, cool. And we can still filter, and it filters really quickly. Alright, so that's it. Hopefully you guys liked this, you enjoyed it, you learned something from it, and I will see you next time.